right, Nick. You are a best-selling author, investigative journalist, and leading expert in aerospace and defense. Renowned for your groundbreaking work on black projects and advanced technologies, you've authored The Hunt for Zero Point and have contributed extensively to Jane's Defense Weekly. In addition to your aerospace expertise, you are a corporate storyteller, ghostwriter of multiple bestsellers, and your remarkable contributions earned you the prestigious award from the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies in 2021 for your essay on life after death. Nick, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm highly looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, me too, Emmanuel. It's great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
So get right started. Your career in particular is interesting because I feel it mirrors the evolution of the field of ufology in a sense that you started off only focused on nuts and bolts, and now you're deeply involved in consciousness studies and the metaphysical, which I feel is a shift that has also occurred in the field of ufology as a whole. What's your take on this transition, both on your end and why the entire field of ufology is heading more towards the metaphysical, away from nuts and bolts only?
Well, I can certainly speak to my end of that. As you say, for me, I started out on this trail a dyed-in-the-wool materialist. I worked in an incredibly material sector, at least reporting on that sector, which, as you said, was aerospace and defense. And I really immersed myself in it. I started out as a cub reporter in my early 20s on a very kind of nuts and bolts trade magazine where literally my task for the day was to go out as the most junior reporter in this publication and report on what we call, here in the UK, we call widgets. So the smallest possible thing that could remotely go into an aircraft or a defense system. And that was my job. So from there, I kind of moved up the chain and I graduated finally to become the aerospace editor of Jane's Defense Weekly. And I was always I'd always been very interested in aerospace. So for me, for many years, that was my focus. I was just solidly on that. But then I started to become a bit distracted by some really interesting things that were going on in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of those things were in secret programs that were happening in America. It was an era when stealth as a technology was beginning to be developed, but had not yet really been revealed. And in the meantime, there were all of these kinds of traces in the environment where people were saying, I've seen something strange in the sky that doesn't comport with my, knowledge about aircraft programs. And maybe this thing was flying in the middle of the night, or it was over the desert somewhere. And, that was my job. My job was to go and find out what this stuff was. So I found that whole secrecy thing deeply interesting. And I wasn't really very focused on UFOs. In fact, throughout the time I was at Jane's, even though I, as you say, I'd written a book called The Hunt for Zero Point, which was amazingly 25 years ago, almost now. But that book was my trying to investigate a breakthrough propulsion system. And even though I suppose you could say that the end result of that would be something possibly that would look like a UFO. I mean, had mankind developed the wherewithal to develop this breakthrough propulsion, this anti-gravity propulsion. Despite all of that, I really wasn't thinking about UFOs at all. I was really locked into this sort of mindset of, what's the deepest, darkest secret in my field of aerospace that a company or a country could have achieved. And I thought it would have been this kind of anti-gravity breakthrough propulsion thing. So Emmanuel, in answer to your question, that sort of was the beginning of my own progression, which was I had taken my nuts and bolts investigation as far as it would go. And then later in life, for reasons perhaps we'll come to, when I did start to become interested in UFOs, and that, by the way, was really in connection to the consciousness dimension. When that happened, I realized that, and actually I was in a very fortunate position because I'd spent 20-something years of my career investigating the nuts and bolts thoroughly, right the way down to the whole secrecy thing of black programs, stealth and hypersonics and goodness knows what. And I was pretty confident that further investigation of the nuts and bolts end of the spectrum was not going to yield any answers. So I could only come at it from the other end of the spectrum, which was the consciousness direction. And so that was something that I decided to do. The second part of your question, which was about, can I explain how this has been reflected in what, ufology in general has been doing? I can't obviously answer that definitively, but I can make some guesses. And one of those would be that, my journey is probably a reflection of everyone else's, which is if you've looked long and hard enough at the nuts and bolts dimension for your answers and you've not got any, or rather you've not got them to the satisfaction that you would like for your curiosity to be solved or resolved, then you have to approach it from another angle, just as I did. So I don't know. I maybe it's not a great answer, but it might give us something to riff off as we continue this discussion.
That's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. So you believe that aerospace and defense corporations or governments are somehow involved in reverse engineering non-human technology. Now, if so, where do you think these technologies originate and how did these entities gain access to it? And by entities, I obviously mean the human corporations and government.
Well, for a very long time, I didn't believe there was an affirmative answer to that question. In other words, in fact, actually, in some ways, this was quite an interesting reflection on me. And maybe it bespeaks something of where we as human beings are and go generally, in that there was a part of me that refused to believe that was possible, that aerospace corporations had in their basements somewhere a craft of non-human origin which they were tinkering around with to try and get its secrets to be revealed. I just didn't believe that. I thought I was so steeped in my background. And I've been to, in the course of my job, I've been to the Skunk Works in Palmdale, and I've interviewed Skunk Works bosses from Ben Rich on down, so, and on location. So I have a very sort of privileged view and access of that environment. And clearly a lot more of it had rubbed off on me than I thought, because as I said, I just couldn't accept that the sector as I knew it could have a secret that deep and that dark. And bear in mind, I'd already looked at one, which was, had it cracked the whole anti-gravity thing? And I still refuse to believe that they had squirreled away, alien technology somewhere, however we define alien technology, by the way. So that's one thing. Let's park that for a second. The second aspect of that question, which is, if they are doing it, what do I think they are? Where do I think they come from? I think that is an incredibly complicated answer. Rather, it's an interesting question, and there are no simple answers to it. Clearly, things have crashed. I think that is now beyond dispute. It's certainly in my mind, it's beyond dispute that things have fallen to earth. The problem I'm then wrestling with is sort of, it falls into Jacques Vallee territory, because as you will know, and many listeners and viewers will know, Jacques Vallee for many decades has maintained that UFOs are both physical and non-physical. And I wrestled with that for years and years. I couldn't get my head around how things that people see in the sky, of which I was relatively persuaded that, from some time back, that people were seeing things, as many of them as they saw them. In other words, faithfully reporting UFOs. But I just could not wrap my brain around how they could be both physical and non-physical. But that was when I was steeped in my materialist mindset. The moment you flip your mindset and you go, well, hang on a second, for all of these people to be reporting these phenomena or this phenomenon, maybe we've got the framework of our perception system wrong. What if our perceptual mechanisms were very different from the ones that we're brought up to believe they are? Again, materialist, physical, light reflected off objects brought into your retina and all the rest of it. Well, of course, all of that goes on, but that's in our 3-4 dimensional paradigm that it's going on. What lies beyond that? What could there be an interface to our perception that projects things in a sense that are not real in our paradigm? And anyone who is familiar with the work of Professor Donald Hoffman, a cognitive scientist from the University of California, Irvine, I think, will know that he's come up with a really interesting theory about how we perceive reality, which is sort of like the desktop, the interface on my computer that we're talking to each other through now. On that interface, on that desktop, I have icons. In order to make my computer work, I have to click on those icons, which are very simple representations of all of the bits and bytes and squirrely bits of electronics that go in to make up my computer. Those would be impossible for me as a non-programmer to navigate, but the icons make it very, very simple. So Professor Hoffman says, surely or possibly, reality is constructed in a rather similar way, in that we perceive things on an interface of perception. We click on things as icons. Those icons happen to be infinite. And Hoffman refers to them as conscious agents. Every time those conscious agents are clicked on and interact, or we interact with them, they generate more data, which feeds back into the system. So maybe at some point in this conversation, we can come back to the thought or possibility that reality is a computer-driven model that requires data in order for it to learn and grow. And as such, all of those interactions between all of those conscious agents feeding back into the system might just be the workings of a very interesting machine. So sorry, Emmanuel, I've taken you on a canter through my sort of fevered brain. But where we've ended up is probably several light years in the conversation beyond where we should be, because I've sort of jumped ahead to what you could begin to describe maybe as an end point. But I hope somewhere in that I answered a few of your questions.
I absolutely love it. Although I have to admit that you've answered about 5 upcoming questions, but we'll get to all of those subjects. So thank you so much. To get back to UFOs or UAPs real quick, because there are talks about, like, obviously UFOs crashing, but then there also is mention of these craft potentially being donated, so to speak. Why would non-human entities allow their technology to be recovered by certain countries or corporations, making their existence undeniable to a select few? Shouldn't they operate beyond human power structures?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I'm going to preface this, and in fact, actually going to preface everything with I've always found it helpful in my own thinking not to adhere to any rigid views. And I always say this, I reserve the right to change my mind on this subject at any time. Because, in part, I think, because actually that is what the phenomenon requires of us, is to be flexible in that way. It's almost teasing us with over our rigidity as human beings. If we're rigid on certain things, you can bet that the phenomenon is going to have a go at you to show you that, well, actually, maybe reality is a lot more malleable than you think it is. So that preface up front, I'm going to start by saying, I don't know, but it's possible that some craft land in a controlled way, I guess. To your question, a very good one, why would a non-human intelligence bequeath or hand over that technology to us? I struggle with that. I've no good answers for that at all. Do I believe in treaties between aliens and human beings? I struggle with that cognitively. I really do. But again, I'm going to try and keep an open mind. So I'm going to skip that bit and then go to crashes. I think certainly if you go on testimony, as I said earlier, it's pretty much beyond doubt, at least in my mind, that technology has been retrieved, whether of intact craft or bits of craft. So why would they crash? Well, conceivably, it's because there is something about our environment that makes them susceptible to whatever it is that we're putting into the environment. That could be, radar waves or radio waves or some other form of interference which just interferes with them and makes them crash, possibly. There's a more interesting dimension to it for me, which is how would a craft that is effectively non-physical, to the second part of Vallee's postulate that some craft are both physical and non-physical, how could a non-physical thing crash? And that then becomes a really mind-bending gallop through the whole consciousness space, which is, again, if what we perceive as reality is a 3/4 dimensional construct of a much deeper reality set, but which is a framework, to Donald Hoffman's point, to allow us to survive as material beings, which in turn, as material beings, maybe we are just here to pump data back into the system on a material level, because I think to a system that would be of value and interest. But if we go with that, perhaps the moment those symbols, those icons that are non-physical but which appear in our skies, the moment they enter our reality space, our 4-dimensional reality space, they become in effect as physical as we are. And at that moment, they become susceptible to all the laws of our 4-dimensional reality space, including things like radar systems, weapon systems. I mean, I don't know whether any UFOs have been shot down. There are rumors that they have, but who knows? But at that point, they transcend from being 5th dimensional into 3-dimensional craft, and susceptible, as I said, to conceivably to our environment, whatever that, however that presents itself. So I'm not sure. Again, I've quite answered your question, Emmanuel, but as it is a simply impossible question to answer, that is probably the best I could do for the moment.
It's definitely a difficult subject to break down in layman's terms. So thank you. Did a fantastic job. Now, despite claims of reverse engineering non-human technology and developing anti-gravity, no nation, despite geopolitical conflict, has revealed technology that challenges current physics. What's your take on this? Who do you think is controlling this technology beyond nation borders?
Well, I wrote a book, as you mentioned at the beginning, called The Hunt for Zero Point, which sought to tackle the question of had there been a breakthrough in propulsion physics that would enable human beings to develop their own advanced aerospace craft that would, to all intents and purposes, look pretty much like a UFO. I don't want to spoil that book for people who haven't read it, because it is constructed a bit like a thriller, deliberately, because it's an esoteric subject, but commissioned by a mainstream publisher, and I wanted to bring as many mainstream readers into that topic as possible. So it is built a bit like a page turner, but slight spoiler alert. At the end of the journey, and what I hope most readers would agree is actually the most interesting thing about the book probably is the journey aspect of it, in that it takes you into some places that were of deep interest to me throughout the aerospace and defense sector. But at the end of that journey, I say, this has been a fascinating 10 years, because that's what it took me to research it, pretty much. But actually, at the end of this journey, I'm still left scratching my head. And but this was written in the year 2000, or finished in the year 2000. And I was scratching my head then, and to an extent, I still am. But now I'm faced with another question altogether, and it's one we've been discussing, which is, there's purely man-made technology on one level, which would result in man-made anti-gravity technology with no help from anyone else, non-human intelligence. But actually, there's now a second question, which is the one we've been discussing, which is, have we, mankind, through aerospace and defense companies, and at a very secret level, have they been trying to reverse engineer stuff that's crashed to Earth? So I don't know how that technology if it exists, is controlled. Sort of the glib answer to that, I suppose, is it's not even that glib, actually. It's a serious answer, is that there are multiple levels of control for how information is contained, starting with deception, which is a good one. And the UFO phenomenon is so odd and multifaceted that you can hide a range of stuff behind it. And as we know from archive testimony and evidence already, the CIA admitted, I think it was in the 1990s, or it may have been more recently, that it had used the UFO smokescreen to cover up some of its real world spy assets, its spy programs, like the U-2 spy plane and the A-12 spy plane in the 1950s and 60s. So ufology provides a very useful cover behind which you can hide real world stuff. So that's one form of control. And then, of course, there are physical aspects of control. Rings of security around particular programs, and those exist and are very real. People often say to me, well, you can't hide a secret for 80 years. If you take the Roswell crash as a kind of baseline for the emergence of the phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon in the modern era, you can't hide a program like that for 80 years. Well, actually, you can. And I mean, I've been on the edges of technology, particularly, in the 80s and 90s, when my colleagues and I were looking at stealth and hypersonics, which was being developed in secret. Those programs contained thousands of people, all of whom were working in compartmented sectors to ensure that the whole secret never got out. People building the stealth fighter, if they were working on its electronics or its undercarriage, they would have had no clue what the aircraft was they were actually building it for. Or if they did have a clue, there was nothing they could go on to prove it, what it was one way or the other. That secret held for a very long time. It held for over a decade, sort of 12 years. And that was for an itty bitty, now as we look at it, stealth program. I mean, very significant at the time, but with hindsight, it was just a man-made aircraft. So what would you do with something that was truly exotic? I mean, that secret would hold. So to wrap it up, there are many levels of control, and they're all pretty effective. I mean, actually, the one that is probably most effective is ridicule, because these days there is such a thin line, a blurred line between what is real and what is fake. It's incredibly hard to, even with a really experienced eye, I look at stuff on X, or wherever, YouTube, that purports to be a UFO or some kind of exotic top secret aircraft. And it's hard to make the distinction, but because AI and digital tech is so good now, to make the distinction between a real piece of imagery and something that's fake. So, that's another layer of control. And then you've got the ridicule thing on top, which is, I'm glad to say, dissolving a little bit, but not completely. And you've got a pretty effective system for keeping secrets in place.
Yeah. Now, UFOs are so fascinating also because they challenge our perception and understanding of reality. And you already mentioned Jacques Vallee and Donald Hoffman. I want to begin by a quote that you've once made. You said, "How do we perceive reality? Because if we can bend reality, we have a weapon. And if you can't defend against someone who bends reality, you've got a problem." That's where this debate should be focused, and that's where most of the answers lie. I hope I've quoted that correctly, but could you explain a little bit more what exactly you've meant by that?
Well, I through the things that we've discussed, I have covered many aspects of warfare in my career, and I'm interested in history as well. So if you take the progression of warfare from earliest times through the 20th century to now, there's a progression. First of all, we conquer the land space. We then conquer the sea space. Then comes the airspace. Now we have a space force. America has a space force. Space is now a kind of fourth weapons battle space domain. But then there are other domains too. I remember while I was covering both Gulf Wars, the information warfare space became very critical. That was another battle space. How you dominated information through what was said. If a war, the first Gulf War in 1991, was kind of played out through our television screens for the first time live. And with that came the corollary that was an information space, if you like. It was a battle space that needed to be conquered. America and its allies did that very well. Iraq, as we know, didn't do it very well. It hadn't grasped the concept. So, and then from there, you can go into psychological operations and how you try to bend and shape an enemy's will to fight. And if you follow that progression, you see that there aren't that many left to conquer in terms of battle spaces, but one of them is consciousness. And that's interesting and frightening because officially science isn't reconciled to what consciousness is. Well, it is to what it is, but not how we derive consciousness, how we derive our own consciousness. And yet, I think there are indications that consciousness, which shapes our reality, is something that adversaries are looking at to try and understand from a battle space perspective. I think that's probably what I meant by that quote when I quoted it, that you just quoted. And that's certainly where, what I'm sort of focused on and thinking about now, Emmanuel. But I think it's a logical progression and a sad one, frankly, that, that is how humanity treats, or not humanity, but how the military and the intelligence world treats that space. I would hold, and I would hope many people would hold, and I'm not just talking about ancient wisdom here, that how we derive our consciousness is a pretty sacred thing, actually. It and should be held as such. So, moving into a domain where that is seen as something you can weaponize is a pretty sad indictment on where we have ended up as a species in the whatever it is, third decade of this millennium.
Yeah, and I fully agree, and obviously that ties into the idea that has surfaced a lot lately, which is spiritual warfare. And you mentioned Jacques Vallee, who also famously talks a lot about the control mechanism, suggesting that if human beings can be controlled through states of consciousness, basically. Now, if that would be the case, who would be the parties involved in such control?
Well, there's no point answer to that, I don't think. I think it is, the answers are as multifaceted as your question, actually, in that if we, again, go back to what we were talking about earlier about Donald Hoffman's perceptual interface, which, by the way, he maintains is underwritten by a code, a mathematical code. I don't know whether that's true. I'm not even sure that Don Hoffman could prove that yet. But if it is underwritten by a code of some description, then someone somewhere is going to think, well, I can unpick that code. And when I unpick that code, I have control of this battle space domain. So on one level, I think that there would be, you could just naturally understand this, again, sadly, that human nature being what it is would seek to try and unpick the secrets of that cognitive human interface and try to unravel the code, if there is one. But I think what it would discover, humanity that is that on that interface and behind it are many other intelligences that are, to Jacques Vallee's point, seeking to do the same thing. So I had the great privilege of knowing Ingo Swann, who some of your listeners and viewers will know was the sort of lead psychic in the CIA remote viewing program, which was formed in the early 1970s. And Ingo always said that if you don't take control of your own, he called them psychic systems, someone else will do that for you. So, it's important that we take responsibility for our own sort of, quotes, psychic health. And I think, reverting to your question is who or what underpins or underlies Jacques Vallee's control system theory is it could be an infinite number of what Ingo used to call energies and forces that are just, like currents in the air or currents in the sea that are just swirling at multiple levels on multiple frequencies, and without us even knowing it, influencing our behavior. So all of that for me is a sort of theoretical framework, which is interesting. I'm a great fan of Jacques Vallee. I've met him a few times, and I've read all of his books, and I think he's a prodigious intellect. A brave soul. This was someone who was saying a lot of this stuff 50 years ago, when it was really unfashionable. I mean, there's a certain, if we can call it this, a fashion to what we're discussing now. But there wasn't when he set out. It was a pretty lonely road. But his control system theory, now what, sort of 50 odd years old, I think holds a lot of water and stands up to scrutiny. So, it's it's a really interesting starting point, I think, for anyone who wants to sort of look at where consciousness, our consciousness, elides with the UFO phenomenon, because those two things aren't necessarily intuitive. They can be quite counterintuitive, at least to begin with. When people say to me, "What is the overlap between the UFO phenomenon and human consciousness?" Well, we've explored a lot of that in the last 45 minutes or so, but it isn't at all. It isn't a natural proposition for people to get their heads around. And as I said, it wasn't natural for me to get my head around for a very long time, except and until you start to look at the nature of reality differently. And that's when the UFO phenomenon, it doesn't make sense, because it still doesn't make sense. But you can begin to perhaps pick away at some of its edges and go, well, maybe this is less about people traveling here from planets and star systems that are light years away, and maybe it's more about a sort of symbolically based mechanism for changing our perception. And then, as you say, the nub of your question is, who or what is doing that controlling of our perception? Well, that's, I've stumbled through bits of that answer, Emmanuel, but that is a whole new order of complexity, which perhaps we could get into in a few, if we have a few minutes as we approach.
Of course, please go ahead.
Which is, for me, and I'm going to pause to take a sip of water, but for me, it is a sort of, it resides in a question of who, if there is a control system, who's the ultimate architect of the control system? Is there an ultimate architect of the control system? Does that get back to a model of reality which perhaps points to a computer-based, information-based system that undergirds our material, physical universe? And if there is an architect or a single architecture, how is it that other players in that space are able to hold sway, achieve dominance? And question, can they ever achieve dominance? Or does the architect, a bit like the architect of a computer game, if it gets a bit overloaded and fed up with what the players in the game are trying to do, it just crashes the system, or at least goes, you know what, I'm in charge of this, or, the simulation is the ultimate authority, and I'm just going to override you, and, we're going to reboot the system, and we're all going to go back to square one. So, I don't know. It's all rhetorical, but these are sort of some of the questions that intrigue me, and occasionally, I like to ponder as I'm strolling through the countryside here.
No, I fully understand that, because the UFO phenomena is so interesting because it brings spiritual aspects in the conversation. There is increased talks about psionics and about life after death, and they all seem to sort of overlap into each other, which really makes it very difficult for our mainstream model of reality to reconcile all of these different aspects, yet alone a single one of them. However, there have been several models of reality throughout time that have tried and attempted a worldview in which you have hierarchy of non-human beings, where you have spiritual abilities, where you have a lot of these elements that we are now struggling to reconcile. You've mentioned Donald Hoffman already. There's also, I mean, Jacques Vallee famously is interested in Rosicrucianism. There are other Hermetic systems. There are ancient Eastern systems. There's a lot of like Western esotericism, such as Rudolf Steiner, Blavatsky, or even Emanuel Swedenborg, that make very detailed attempts about modeling a framework for reality that basically has a room for all of those different phenomena. So I guess my question to you would be, which of these models, if any, do you feel best accounts for all of these different phenomena that modern science struggles to unite, reconcile, and explain?
Well, I wouldn't pretend to be either knowledgeable or arrogant enough to answer that question with any degree of certitude. But if we start from sort of basics, which is, for me, I mean, I'm confident based on all the data that comes my way, that we live in a consciousness-derived, consciousness-driven universe, which presents itself to us in a framework, a three-dimensional, four-dimensional framework, based on a space-time general relativity architecture that gives us the sort of the boundaries of that framework, and that this has been useful for us, again, per Donald Hoffman, to build a model that allows us to navigate this 3-4 dimensional material world for our survival. And it gives us only the things that we need for our survival. Again, exactly as Donald Hoffman lays it out. But what I say, I mean, I've got a Substack column, which I call Rogue Icons, which is kind of a nod to Donald Hoffman, because there are rogue icons, there are non-standard, non-consensual icons that appear on our reality screen every now and again, which are not just necessarily UFOs. They are, I suppose, what we would call paranormal phenomena, ranging from UFOs to apparitions, ghosts, to even to kind of cryptozoological creatures that people see that make no sense. Yeti, Bigfoot, even the Loch Ness monster. I mean, these are things that people report, and they make no sense. And so I kind of refer to them as rogue icons. But that for me is, Philip K. Dick talked about orthogonal reality structures, which were sort of baseline realities that would leach through and seep into our own and overlap and cross over. And there's some very interesting talks that he's given, and maybe you could list some of those, or at least one of them, which was a speech that he gave in Switzerland about these sort of what he called orthogonal reality structures, which actually informed a lot of his work. Things like The Man in the High Castle, which was about sort of overlapping realities. Well, I think Philip K. Dick was a very sort of enlightened individual who got these very complicated ideas down in science fiction form, but underpinning them were a lot of things that actually make a lot of sense. And I do think that we are this orthogonal reality structure thing that he talked about, where you would get blended realities. So for Philip K. Dick, who, it has to be said, had suffered from, he suffered from depression, but he also suffered from schizophrenia as well. But you could also argue, I think, that those afflictions gave him windows into reality that perhaps other people wouldn't see. But he maintained that he had experienced alternate realities in which he was experiencing times during the Roman Empire, for example, and that those realities crossed into our own. I think, as we approach the top of the hour, I note that I think that we are living in very strange times right now, wherein we feel that reality has sort of started to go a bit squirrely on us. It's not the kind of rooted in some of the firm foundations that my generation grew up in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, but is now nothing feels very certain. And I talk to my kids about this and their friends, and they say the same thing. There is a sort of anxiety based on this idea for many people, I think, that the sort of safe certitudes of the world have hugely disappeared, and we're in this kind of strange merged reality state, a bit like the one that Philip K. Dick described. So this is where I think we are, Emmanuel. That's possibly the subject of a whole different conversation, but we live in interesting times, and I don't say that lightly, because we live in scary times too, and somehow I think this is playing out in front of us in strange ways, and it'll be interesting to see how the next few years shape up.
Definitely. And very interesting subject. Do you believe that reality can be understood intellectually, or does it require a heightened state of consciousness to better comprehend what is really going on, which will lead me to my next question of how would one tap into more of core reality? Because as you described a lot of Donald Hoffman's perspective, we are basically only aware of a very limited, narrow lens of reality, and are missing out on a lot of other things that are going on. So how would one go about perceiving more of core reality? Is that what all of these ancient teachings and mystery schools and meditations and rituals were all about?
I think they were. I think that, and I wrote about this in my Bix essay, the essay that I entered for the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies competition. There are numerous different sort of contact modalities that allow you to experience the deeper reality. Some of those are quite obvious, like psychedelics. People ingest psychedelics, and they're, the material framework of our constructed world dissolves, and we see things differently. There are others, trance states that you can get into, which allow access to that, and less conventional, not that they are particularly conventional, but areas like UFO encounters, per Jacques Vallee's data-driven observations often result in what he calls high strangeness. There is a kind of bending of reality where time sort of ceases to hold the values that it does in our own reality space or our sort of normal reality space. And so all of these, there are many different access points to these shifted reality perspectives. Meditation would be another one. And the question's an interesting one because it's one that my wife and I, funnily enough, debate quite a lot, because she, and as some people will know, because I've talked about it, I really only decided to look at the consciousness domain extensively after my wife had had a shared death experience upon the death of her mother. And so she was holding her mum's hand at the precise moment her mum died. My wife, Ali, was somewhere else, she said. And for her, it was infinite and connected. And it felt like, she said, home. I mean, that was the place where it felt strange coming back to this place, which felt alien to the place where she had been. Now, I have had no experience like that at all, but she's my wife of a very long time, and I know what she experienced was real. Plus, when I Googled this, I thought, well, what on earth had happened to her when it happened? It was about a decade ago. What on earth had happened to her? I found out, to my surprise, that this thing that she'd experienced, many other people had experienced too. And I kind of knew a little bit about near-death experiences, but I'd never heard of a shared death experience before. But SDEs are a thing. And so this is underpinned by data. It's not just a bunch of people making this up. Tens or hundreds of thousands, millions of people have had experiences like this. But the debate that we have, Ali and I, is this a science that can be unpicked, to your question, or is it actually something that we will never, ever get to the bottom of, we'll never derive the answer to? She, being very spiritual, goes, I think this is and should always remain a mystery. And I'm going, well, actually, I rather think it should be treated as a conundrum to be unpicked and solved by science. So, I totally respect her viewpoint, and I totally respect anyone who has that view that this is, and actually I subscribe to it myself as well. It is a sacred thing, what she experienced, and the reality interface too, I think, is a sacred thing. But that doesn't stop us either from trying to understand it and using the tools of science to do so.
Well, Nick, you've been extremely generous with your time already. Thank you so much for speaking to me today.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Emmanuel. I've really enjoyed the conversation and your questioning. So it's led to some interesting avenues of thought for me as we've gone through this. So thank you.